Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Navigating the Uncertainty of Brexit to Plot a Course for Success. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. For any emails that we are not able to answer, today's presenter will respond directly to you via email. Today's webinar is being recorded and you will receive a follow-up email with a link to view the recording. Our speakers today are Mark Fagan, Merrick Lowe, Kevin Phillips, John Stanford, and Nick Warner. And now I'd like to introduce Mark Fagan to begin today's presentation.
Thank you, Tracy. Hello, and welcome to the Brexit webinar. This is the first in a series of webinars we are giving to help business owners understand how and when Brexit will affect doing business in the UK and beyond. The webinar is a collaboration between Citrin Cooperman and Moore Stephens, our international association, who we work with constantly on many joint projects and clients. I'm Mark Fagan, a managing partner at Citrin Cooperman and co-leader of our international strategy group. I'm going to be the moderator today, and I've got a panel of 4 experts from the Moore Stephens London office. All are heavily involved in understanding and consulting with their clients as they navigate Brexit. They are John Stanford, a director within the Moore Stephens Governance, Risk, and Assurance Group with a specific focus on business transformation, IT change assurance, and program management. Kevin Phillips, a partner in the Moore Stephens Business Tax Team, specializing over the last dozen years exclusively in international tax. Kevin's work includes the tax-efficient structuring and financing of both overseas operations of UK companies and UK operations of foreign multinationals. Nick Warner, a VAT specialist with over 25 years of experience with VAT. Nick has a particular focus in the insurance sector and also has a wide experience in the real estate sector, particularly care homes and in hotels and leisure. And lastly, Merrick Lowe, a partner focusing on expert witness evidence, specialist investigations, transaction disputes, valuations, and fraud investigations. So this slide, in the next slide, show just a few quotes on the views of Brexit. The first from Theresa May, the Prime Minister, is interesting. Almost needed to reaffirm, yes, Brexit happened, and we are going to have to do it. But there's a lot of confusion right now as far as what is happening and what is not happening. Here are a few more on the next slide. Uncertainty is a common theme, and it's now becoming very clear that this is and is going to be a daunting task. One thing is for sure, the opinions are as varied as the path of Brexit. Today and in this series, we hope to keep you informed as the path becomes more clear. So here are the objectives of today's webinar. First, for our audience in the States, we will refresh your memory on Brexit. Then we will have an overview of the status of Brexit as we know it now. So let's get right to it. So again, as a reminder, what is the EU? The European Union, also known as the EU, is an economic and political partnership involving 28 European countries. It began after World War II to foster the economic cooperation and, frankly, to help prevent another world war. It has since grown to become a single market, which allows goods and people to move around, basically as if the member states were one country. It has its own currency, the euro, which is used by 19 of the member countries, its own parliament, and it now sets rules in a wide range of areas, including on the environment, transport, consumer rights, and even such things as mobile phone charges. In June 2016, the United Kingdom had a countrywide vote on whether to stay in the EU or leave, and the vote was to leave by a very narrow margin. So the Brexit talks are underway. They finally started on June 19th of 2017. Here's a picture of the first session. The UK and EU negotiating teams meet face-to-face for 1 week each month. So let's talk about who the players are. From the UK side, Theresa May, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And as you might remember, her June 8th, 2017 snap election, which left her without a majority in the House of Commons, has raised doubts over whether she will even be able to see the 2-year process through. She will not take part in the day-to-day negotiations, but is expected to set Britain's approach and have the final say on any compromises or concessions. The day-to-day work is being left to David Davis, the Brexit Secretary who will lead negotiations for the UK. Now on the EU side, it's Michel Barnier, the European Commission chief negotiator who will be across the table from Mr. Davis. He has been given a mandate by the leaders of the remaining EU 27 states to focus initially on 3 key elements of the withdrawal package. And we'll get into that in a bit. So here's the overview, and I'm going to hand it off to John to take us through it.
Thank you, Mark. So what we thought we'd try and do is to give a bit of background on what it is, the decision that was taken and the timetable that's being effected now. So going back to last year, the referendum was held on the 23rd of June, and it was the UK public being asked a straightforward yes/no question as to whether or not they wanted to stay within the European Union. Now, given this question, it's a fairly oversimplified question for something that's arguably the most complex political problem of our generation. But if you set aside that oversimplification, we need to kind of consider the impact of the decision and to try and gain an understanding of what it is that we're leaving, and in fact what it is that we need to replace. So furthering your question around what is the European Union, as you quite rightly pointed out, it's a single market of 28 countries. That's grown up from the original small group of members over the past 40 years. It's based on 4 underlying principles: the fundamental freedoms of movement, movement of goods, services, people, and capital. Overseeing this from a legislative point of view is the European Court of Justice, the ECJ. I suppose it's kind of similar to the Federal Supreme Court in the US at the moment. That has authority over the member states, an overarching authority, if you like, regarding the laws governing those 4 principles. So currently, being part of the EU, we have a customs union which allows tariff-free goods and services. In other words, those are goods received into or initiated within an EU country that are not subject to additional tariffs when moved from one EU country onto another. We've then got passporting of financial services. This includes recognizing the qualifications of industry professionals and the standards that they use, such that the services can then be provided across border without the need for further control or authorization. And finally, looking at the right to work in any EU state, this focuses on the right to move freely across the borders, knowing that there's a retention of human rights, of workers' rights, and with a consistency in which those rights are applied. So I've put this slide together to kind of illustrate the timetable again. So since last year, the referendum just signified the UK's intent, if you like, a desire to leave. But it wasn't until March this year that the government invoked Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. That started a 2-year process to negotiate the exit deal. So that's the first part. There then followed a couple of months until June of this year, where the EU Council agreed the terms under which the conditions for negotiation should take place. And it's that period that we're in now, where we're running through those preconditions, which is around citizens' rights, the Irish border, and the cost of us actually exiting. It's otherwise known as the divorce bill. We are expecting that the UK government will make it clear to business and everybody else alike by the end of this year precisely what the conditions are, such that we've got enough of a negotiating stance with the EU, and we can then get on with the process of negotiating throughout the course of the next 10 months. October next year, the UK government, have to present the details of that deal to the EU Parliament and to the EU Council, and hopefully, if everything is okay from that point of view, they then discuss amongst themselves during what is being termed the ratification process. If they ratify it, it's then through to March 2019, where the UK government then presents it to UK Parliament, and if all is good and everybody's happy with it, we're then at the point where a Brexit deal is agreed, and the UK then exits. So
John, how does it pass through Parliament? Meaning, what type of majority, supermajority, simple majority, in order to before you bring it to the EU?
Yeah, sure. I suppose quite simply, it's like any other debate that goes on in the UK Parliament, in that the government can only pass such bills with a majority vote. So that'll be the same situation here. So if they get the majority vote against the deal, then the deal's agreed.
Okay.
Okay. So if I look at the next slide, where we just have a quick look further at the actual pre-negotiation requirements that I mentioned earlier. So we're talking citizens' rights. Firstly, this is in particular looking at the rights of something like 3 million EU citizens living and working in the UK, plus 1 million UK citizens similarly living in the EU. The main issues here involve the agreement to allow extended families of those citizens to assume the same rights as those citizens themselves, and also about enshrining UK or EU law, I beg your pardon, into the UK. This is known as something called the direct effect. There is a problem with this in that, of course, EU citizens, if they have recourse to EU law as well as the UK law, they could therefore end up having actually more rights than UK citizens themselves. So that point is still being discussed. Irish border. Simply, this is around the issue of allowing frictionless trade via the land bridge between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And remember that is the only land border between the UK and Europe. Current arrangements that have been in place have helped to ease those difficulties across the Irish border, and really, quite frankly, there's no desire to return to the previous days of suspicion and isolation.
Yeah, and I remember those days. And this is a question for Kevin: will they be needing to have passports then from traveling from the Republic of Ireland up into the north, like they used to, back in the 70s and so forth?
Well, that's an excellent question, Mark. As always, there's quite a bit of background to it. We haven't mentioned it previously, but one aspect of the fundamental principle of the free movement of people within the European Union is something called the Schengen Agreement. And what that basically means is that most European Union countries, you can travel between them without having to show your passport at the border. But in fact, the UK and Ireland have never been part of that agreement. We opted out. So you might think that would mean that when you go from the Republic of Ireland to anywhere in the UK, including Northern Ireland, you need to show your passport. But in fact, because of the long history between the UK and Ireland, and this goes right back to the 1920s when the state of Ireland was first formed, the UK and Ireland have always had their own agreement between themselves, under which Irish citizens can travel to any part of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland, and vice versa, without having to show their passport. So that arrangement predates the European Union by about 50 years. So I'm pretty damn certain that when we exit the European Union, it will continue afterwards. It's an arrangement that's independent of our EU membership.
And it's interesting because, the people in the States really weren't thinking about the issue, and the issue is going to be with business going from Northern Ireland and Dublin to the rest of Ireland, and you've got, talent moving back and forth. All right, so let's get into the divorce bill, because as we've heard so much about that, and the amount of money being discussed is just monumental.
Yeah, it is. So interestingly, with the divorce bill, we start off with a statement which is certainly appears to be non-committal from Prime Minister Theresa May in Florence in a speech in September, where she said the UK will honour its commitments made during the period of our membership. However, we're not yet at the stage of specifying exactly what these commitments are. Okay, that sounds a bit vague, but in fact, actually, the way in which things are worked out is actually extremely complicated. But at the moment, current estimates are suggesting that the UK owes something in the region of $37 billion in budget commitments. But on top of that, in that Florence speech, Theresa May was committing a further $23 billion to be offered as part of a 2-year transition deal.
How long does that money have to be paid? Over what period of time, John?
Essentially, they're looking at the deal up to around 2020. It potentially could go with transition period up to 2021, of course. But in terms of, I suppose, how that deal is put together, Mark, I know there's a question around that, about what goes into calculating the divorce bill, and this has been subject to a lot of discussion. But essentially, there are some figures. So there's an initial budget commitment that the UK has to make, and this, along with other EU countries, is based on a percentage of their gross domestic product. They're pre-agreed figures, and from the UK's point of view, from last year, for example, this would have meant the UK paying a bill of something around 17 billion, and that's pounds sterling as opposed to dollars. But that's not anything that we pay outright straight away, because immediately there's a discount, an instant discount called a rebate that's applied. That was negotiated by the UK a number of years ago as a result of overpaying in the early years of their membership, and that amounts to around about 4 billion a year. So take that off, the net figure then becomes 13 billion, and that's effectively what we actually pay. However, again, off that, there is then an offset from an assessment of the commitment from the EU via research and development grants and other specific projects, if you like, that would see then a further reduction. Last year, all told, that actually amounted to something like around £5 billion. A lot is actually done on things like agricultural subsidies and also subsidies for the poorer regions of the UK. So, in fact, in 2016, down from the original 17 billion, last year the UK was due to pay 7.6 billion. So quite a substantial difference in the payments, I think you can see.
Okay, great. So let's get into some of the options here. How this is going to work.
Yeah, sure. So again, on this side, in terms of trying to describe what's going on, I thought probably the best way to try and deal with it was to look at the 4 freedoms themselves of goods, services, and people and budget, but also in terms of whether or not we actually have any right to a discussion with the EU themselves. And there are a number of variations on a theme, if you like. So let's look at them in terms of other agreements that have been struck by other countries in the past. So first and foremost, if you looked at the EU membership itself, which is what we currently have, clearly we have a seat at the table. We have the ability to discuss and hopefully influence what's actually going on, but we have access or are committed to those 4 freedoms. The second one is what's called the Norway option, which is part of the EEA, and that is the European Economic Area. So what Norway have managed to do is to say that, look, we'll commit to those freedoms, and we'll commit to the regulations that are applied there, but we actually want a reduced payment. So as a result of that reduced payment, they don't get a seat at the table, and therefore they have to accept what the EU says. So sort of slightly less than the UK's on at the moment. The third option, and again, please bear in mind here, it's kind of variations on a theme, but the third one is referred to as the Swiss option, and is similar to what's called the European Free Trade Agreement, EFTA. From an EFTA perspective, this allows more focus on the movement of goods and people, but there is no access to movement of services. I don't know if that's coming up on your screen, because on mine at the moment it just doesn't seem to be refreshing. And I've moved on to the next one. So, but that means that from the Swiss option, it looks like it's not constrained by regulations, but also therefore doesn't allow for passporting of financial services. The third one, which came up on the screen there, with my poor fingers on the button, shows the Turkish option. And from that perspective, you're looking at the essentially what is a customs union, which gives them free access to the markets in terms of exchange of goods, but they don't get access to anything else. So what does that mean to them? It means they have to accept all the EU treaties, but they're not allowed to create new laws without prior EU agreement. If they do create new laws, they have to parallel those of the EU themselves, and they have to be accepting of any of the European Court of Justice, the ECJ rulings. One last point on that, though, is that what this does to Turkey is that it actually opens them up to the import of EU goods, which arguably are at a higher level of quality than their own. So obviously it's going to create internal market frictions, if you like. And then I suppose the final one, which is actually hard Brexit itself, which means that we exit the EU without any deal at all, and we then have to regress, if you like, to simple WTO rules. That means that whilst we're no longer bound by EU treaties, we would therefore need to renegotiate what could be many hundreds of international agreements made by the EU bloc already. One key thing out of that means crucial. Yeah, sure.
Sorry. So, John, in that last scenario, the UK would be no different than the US as far as their relation with the EU.
Essentially, that's correct. Yeah.
And then there's all these laws that are existing that the UK is part of that are in the EU. What happens in a hard Brexit? And now you're no longer bound to those laws. Do you have to rewrite your laws? I mean, what happens?
Yeah. I mean, essentially, there is a case of suggesting that they're going to be automatically passed into UK law. I suppose bear in mind that the UK has been preparing its own laws anyway, in line with the EU for some years anyway. So that, in theory, shouldn't be too tricky, other than for maybe the legal teams who actually have to go through the actual process of rewriting those laws. But that's essentially what would happen, yes.
Okay. So why don't we move on to talking about investing and doing business in the UK? And that's really, Nick, what type of Brexit is the business community hoping for? Is it more hard, more soft? What are they lobbying for?
Okay, well, most businesses and all of the City of London were opposed to Brexit in the first place. So it really follows from that. They want the softest Brexit possible. They want to keep as many borders open, as little duty. A lot of insurers and financial services companies are already sort of contingency planning. For insurers, they need to passport, so they need to set up in another EU country. But I should say that doesn't mean that they'll be moving there. The infrastructure, the support, the employees will largely stay in the City of London, but they'll need a vehicle. But I think it's fair to say there's very few large businesses in the UK that supported Brexit, so they really want the softest Brexit possible.
And what about the Labour Party? That's a very strong constituency in the UK. What is their position on Brexit? Are they going the other way?
Well, their stated focus is on business, jobs, and employment rights that are underpinned by the European Union courts historically. They're already in discussions with Michel Barnier in case there is a change of government, because obviously with the tight deadlines, they can't afford to have had nothing or no contact with them. So if there is a change of government, the Labour Party are already negotiating. I think it's fair to say, as a general point, the Labour Party are more relaxed about freedom of movement. So they have more flexibility, perhaps, in negotiating a soft Brexit.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, so why don't we get into then the investing and doing business?
Okay, so to draw some parallels to help make clearer what might happen in the UK after Brexit, imagine that the New York state had just seceded from the US, and going forward, it would be more difficult for people to come in from New Jersey into Manhattan and from Connecticut into Manhattan. That's exactly the position that faces the UK post-Brexit. So the US companies need to think about whether people can come into the UK and come out of the UK into Europe to do business. They need to think about whether their families can do that, and also whether goods either manufactured in the UK or imported from the US and transferred into Europe can still continue to move. The same thing affects services, because services which are put together and delivered in the UK or transferred across into Europe, either electronically or delivered in person, also will be affected by Brexit. So essentially every aspect of doing business, whether it's the supply of people, supply of goods, the delivery of goods, delivery of services, will change. Now,
Merrick,
the UK...
Merrick, sorry, Merrick, could you give us an example, kind of just an example of the complexities of what could happen with moving people in and out of Europe?
Sure. So right now, moving people to the UK or from the UK to Europe is not too dissimilar to what happens in the US moving state to state. So the only thing that's slightly different in going to Europe or coming back from Europe is you have to prove your identity and prove your citizenship. And once you've proven that you're either British or European, then you can come and go freely. Now, afterward, post-Brexit, instead of being able to come and go freely, you may need a visa in either direction. You may also need to prove that you have an existing job and right to work. You may also need to be able to prove that you can support yourself. Now, all of these things presently apply to US citizens coming to the UK because you're subject to a visa regime. Going forward, that could well apply to British people going to Europe or Europeans coming to the UK. Now, ultimately, what happens is down to what deal is done relating to Europeans coming to the UK, because however we treat Europeans, that will become the deal for how Europe treats UK citizens. So going forward, we may find ourselves subject to a visa regime, much as US people coming to the UK are subject to a visa regime, and subject to restrictions on right to work in Europe.
Interesting. And you know, there's a lot of companies, including my clients, that use the UK as a hub. So meaning they've got US headquarters, and then they've got a European offices, but they also have offices in the UK. And there's a lot of goods and talent that come in and out of the UK before going back to the States. You know, so that hub type of concept. John, and a lot of my clients have goods going to other parts of Europe through the UK. How could this affect the movement of goods from the US into the UK, into the rest of Europe with a Brexit? Can you give us, you know, some practical examples of how operations in a US company could change?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the interesting points that has been discussed over here is the fact of that most goods travel between the UK and mainland Europe on the back of a truck going across the English Channel in a ferry between Dover and Calais. At the moment, there's something like 10,000 trucks going in each direction every day, and on average, they take about 2 minutes to pass through the port. So essentially, we've got the agreement on tariff-free movement, but we've also got agreements on, as we said earlier, once a country has agreed to customs process, for the goods themselves. They can then move across border fairly freely. So that process is working extremely efficiently at the moment. But you've got the ports operating at maximum capacity, so it's a very efficient process. But if you just took an example of saying if we now impose different regulations and that customs declarations need to be made and cleared beforehand, even if you just increase that 2 minutes by another 2 minutes, it's been suggested that those trucks would be then backing up the motorways for 17 miles behind Dover from day one after Brexit. Not exactly a great situation or scenario for those people who are managing just-in-time goods.
No, and that's that's something that, again, people may not be thinking through. A lot of them are focused on customs and VAT tax, and this is a physical issue and efficiency and so forth. But let's talk about VAT and customs, because that's something that the business owners in these states are very concerned about. Nick, how does this movement affect businesses pre versus post Brexit as it relates to customs and duties?
Thank you, Mark. I think it's fair to say, if I could just quote Joni Mitchell, you never know what you've got till it's gone. Now, there's administrative cost and actual costs. Now, if there's a really hard Brexit, it's worth taking you back in history to 1993. In 1993, the single market was introduced, covering all the European Union, and that did a number of things. One of the things it did, it removed the need to pay duty when goods are moved between EU member states. So that was an actual financial saving. What it also did, it replaced the concept of an import with a concept of an acquisition. If goods are moved around between EU member states, they're acquired, not imported. And the distinction is value-added tax, which is currently at 20% in the UK. If you buy goods from Germany and you import them, you acquire them into the UK, you have to account for VAT at 20%, but you can claim it back at 20%, but you don't have to pay anything. Once you're out of the European Union, you will physically have to pay that VAT on import. So that is a cash flow. And to give you an example of the scale, the UK imports about £5 billion worth of goods from Germany each month. So in theory, with a hard Brexit, you're funding £1 billion worth of VAT, i.e. you won't be able to reclaim that back from the tax authorities for potentially 2 to 3 months. So the VAT is a cash flow issue. As regarding services, there's quite a small but significant point on B2C e-services. If you supply those into the EU, they're all subject to VAT. So if your customers are in many states, you'd have to get VAT registered in each state. Under what you've got at the moment is the one-stop shop, and you don't have to do it. But regarding your point and the point that John made about slowing things down at importation, you've got 135 different tariffs and 15,000 commodity codes that you have to process. So what I would say, sort of in conclusion, is if the US is trading with the UK and it wants to trade with the UK, then nothing's going to change. Nothing much is going to change. You're still importing goods, etc. But if you're using the UK as a hub for further trade into the EU, you've now got that duty issue. So from the US to the UK, you pay duty, and then the UK to France, you would pay duty. Just very briefly, there are a couple of upsides to coming out of the European Union. One is the freedom to set VAT rules and rates. So we're no longer bound by the European Court of Justice, so we could set a much lower rate than the 20%. So there's a lot of interesting things, and we needn't panic about this. We don't know where we're going to land with a soft or hard Brexit, but with a hard Brexit, there will be duty costs, real financial costs, there'll be cash flow costs, and everything will be slower at import.
Yeah, thanks, Merrick. Thanks, Nick. From a U.S. CEO, he's sitting here thinking, or she's sitting here thinking, okay, I used to be able to take care of that net. Now I've got a 2 to 3 month cash flow problem. I've got an incremental cost on customs, and now there's probably going to be a slowage of goods, like we talked about with the physical example prior, that those are all real negatives about using the UK as a hub. But now, let's talk about the other types of taxes. Kevin, we're now getting into structure, finance, and the tax part of our presentation. What's interesting is, with Brexit, besides the pound deteriorating after the vote, the UK's economy has actually done quite well in 2016 and to date in 2017. That was a bit of a surprise to a lot of people. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, well, you mentioned the exchange rate. I mean, I guess the first thing to say is that that's actually very good news if you're a foreign investor into the UK since the Brexit vote. So pre the vote, £1 sterling bought you about $1.50. Right now, it only buys you about $1.30. So you should have got a 15% discount if you're a US investor in the UK, which, whatever risks you might see now in investing, that's a big compensation in terms of lower cost of investment. So personally, I'm not so surprised that the economy's done relatively well so far. Certainly what we've seen is a continued appetite for inbound investment into the UK, and no doubt that has helped to keep the growth going. But I suppose the other thing is, if you think back to previous slides on what has really happened since the vote, I mean, in terms of actual change, very little. We've had some negotiations, we've had an agreement to leave the European Union, but we're still members of the EU with all the benefits. So really, very little has happened, and it's all still to happen. That said, of course, 1.8% growth currently is pretty good. It was over that 2 and a bit percent pre the vote, so I think it's already had some effect. It remains to be seen just how much of an impact it has when we really get into the serious negotiations and the future becomes clearer, and indeed when we actually leave the European Union.
So, Kevin, how are you advising your clients right now? You deal with a lot of multinationals, both inbound and outbound with the UK. What I'm sure they're asking you this all the time. What are you telling them?
Well, I think it's a lot more reassuring message perhaps than when it comes to the VAT and customs duties that you've heard my colleagues talking about. You referred to the UK being a hub for Europe, and that goes back a long way. I mean, the UK has always been an attractive location for US business in particular to invest in and add into wider Europe, and that's been the case for a long time. It's the case now. If you look at the reasons for that, a lot of those will not change with Brexit. Just on the UK's corporate income tax rate, which is currently 19%. So I hope you'd agree from a US tax perspective, that's already very attractive. With federal tax at 35% and state tax on top, in the States you're often looking at something approaching a 40% effective tax rate. That is scheduled to fall further to 17% from 2020. So that is a very attractive rate. And if you compare that with the tax rates in a lot of continental Europe, where the effective rates are 30% plus, that means that if you have the classic structure of US with a UK holding company, which in turn owns European subsidiaries, it will continue to be very tax efficient to earn taxable profits in the UK holding company rather than its more highly taxed European Union subs. None of that will change. Now, where Brexit will have an impact is that at the moment, one of the benefits the UK gets from EU membership is that it is subject to the European Union tax directives. And very broadly, what those guarantee is that when European Union subsidiaries make payments of interest and dividends, and by the way, royalties as well, up to a UK parent company, they are completely exempt from any European withholding taxes. And just following that through, the UK doesn't tax incoming dividends from European subs, and the UK does not levy withholding tax when those dividends are paid on and up to, say, a US parent. So you've got the dream scenario where you minimise your profits in the European Union subsidiaries, distribute them up to the UK parent, and then on to the US, and there's no further leakage of tax along the way. Now, post-Brexit, it really depends what deal we're able to do with the European Union. It may be that we're able to negotiate a deal a little like the one that Switzerland has. In fact, Switzerland isn't a member of the European Union, but it has the benefit of those European Union tax directives. We might do a similar deal to Switzerland and continue to get the benefit. But if we don't, it's really not such a bad thing, because the UK has a very wide network of double tax treaties, including with all of the other current members of the European Union, and of course many other countries besides. And even if we leave the European Union with no similar deal on European Union tax directives to what we have now, we can fall back on those treaties, and generally speaking they offer a very similar level of protection, either complete exemption from withholding tax on interest and dividends, and by the way, royalties, or at the worst case, typically no more than 5% withholding tax. So although it'll have an impact, it's nothing like as much as we've been talking about with VAT and customs duties.
And, as this gets negotiated, I would think that the UK and the EU, they don't want to do anything that's going to hurt them from a business perspective, unless someone's going to try to grab more of the pie, if you will, when it comes to withholding tax and dividends. Is there any kind of feel for who's going to have more control at the negotiating table when it comes to things like that?
Well, this runs through a lot of the negotiations in the European Union. There's a lot of common economic interest in trying to perpetuate a lot of the benefits that the European Union and the UK currently have. I think the difficulty is there is a price to membership and there are benefits from membership, and if you cease to be a member, it's quite hard to justify that you should continue to get all the benefits of membership. So where this will ultimately end up is just so uncertain. As I said, the best reason for hope on this particular point is that Switzerland, not a member of the European Union, has negotiated a bilateral arrangement with the European Union where it gets the benefit of all these European tax directives. So there is a precedent out there, so the UK might negotiate that. Whether or not we manage that, I really can't say. But I mean, perhaps the best way to illustrate some of this is with a picture. So
Sure.
If we look at the next slide, perhaps this helps to explain it a bit more clearly. So if you take a simple structure where you have a US parent company and it has a UK intermediate holding company, and that has, say, a Swiss subsidiary. And as I said, Switzerland isn't actually in the European Union, although it benefits from certain agreements with the EU. Now, if you look at the way that profits would flow at the moment, then because the UK is a member of the European Union, and as I say, Switzerland has this deal with the EU where it gets the benefit of EU tax directives, then if the Swiss company pays a dividend up to the UK holding company, at the moment, even though Switzerland has quite a low rate of corporate tax, probably about 15%, under its domestic law, it would have charged a 35% withholding tax on that dividend. But under the agreement between Switzerland and the EU, such a dividend is completely exempt. So the UK company would get a Swiss dividend with no withholding tax deducted at all. As I say, the UK doesn't tax that, and then we distribute it onto states. There's no withholding tax on that dividend, so it flows all the way from Switzerland to the US with no tax leakage along the way. So supposing that the UK leaves the European Union without any of the benefits of EU tax directives, so in future there is no no exemption for that withholding tax under EU tax directives or the deal that Switzerland has with the EU. Well, then the UK falls back on its double tax treaty with Switzerland, and guess what? That fully exempts the dividend anyway, so there would still be no withholding tax on the way up. And by the way, although this, I'm sorry, Mark.
Oh, go ahead, finish, and then I just got a question.
Yeah, I was only going to say, so by the way, although there is a tax treaty between the United States and Switzerland, it only reduces withholding taxes down to 5%. So, treaty shopping aside, it's still beneficial to structure it that way and put the UK in between. So none of that will change post-Brexit. So it's always fact and circumstance specific. But you can see in this, even in this case, that there's really no need for concern.
Right, and if there was, wouldn't there just be an opportunity for the UK to write another tax treaty that would almost put them back in the same spot? But that tax treaty would be specifically with, in this case, Switzerland and the UK. I mean, wouldn't they be free to do something like that?
Yeah, they would be. Of course, there's two sides, so Switzerland would have to agree, and
Sure.
it would be whether or not both sides can agree that it's in their overall interests to do that. Of course, the other thing is tax treaties take years to negotiate, sometimes many years to negotiate, so that wouldn't be a quick fix. But you're right, that's one of the freedoms that we have post-Brexit. And actually, on the subject of freedom, I suppose the other reason for optimism, Nick mentioned that when it comes to VAT, we have a lot more freedom to set our own VAT rates once we leave. Well, actually, exactly the same is true of corporate taxes as well. And this isn't some theoretical thing. I mean, the UK regularly makes laws domestically which are subject to European Union challenge. So to give an example of that, literally in the last few days, the European Commission announced that it was going to challenge certain aspects of the UK's control of foreign companies rules, which I know you have in the States as well. So you imagine the US has its CFC rules, and then some supranational authority challenges you on them and says, well, we don't think those are valid. That's what we faced for many, many years with our tax law. Going forwards, we no longer be subject to that. So supposing we want to lower our corporate tax rate even lower to 15% or 10%, we'd be free to do that, where at the moment, I dare say the European Union would be likely to challenge that.
Yeah, so you had a lot of benefits from having a group like that, but then you were also constrained by whatever the group decides. You're going to have to go along with it. Could you see the UK becoming competitive and, your EU has this withholding tax, so then the UK drops a withholding tax 5 points below to try to enhance more commerce into the UK versus the EU, and basically having some competition now that the gloves have come off, if you will, and they're not tied to being part of a larger group that has different needs and restrictions. They don't have any restrictions anymore. So could you see that going back and forth in legislation?
Well, the UK government actually not long ago effectively threatened exactly that. So on the specific point of withholding tax, just bear in mind we actually don't have a withholding tax under our domestic law. So once it's at zero, you can't reduce it any lower. But when it comes to the corporate tax rate, certainly an early negotiating stance was to say, well, we want to do a good deal with you, but if you play hardball, don't think that we might not lower our corporate tax rate much, much lower to make ourselves really, really competitive compared with other European Union tax rates. So obviously that wasn't a popular thing to say, but we've already threatened it. Whether we'd actually do that, well, you've got to be able to afford a tax cut, of course. It's already pretty low.
Right, understood. So then this kind of gets us back to our last component, which is talent, which is also one of the first components that they're trying to deal with right now, because frankly, everything surrounds around human capital, doesn't it? And Merrick, I think currently there's 1.2 million UK citizens living elsewhere in the EU and 3.1 million EU citizens living in the UK. What's going to happen to all these people in the next, after the next couple of years?
Well, if we assume that the UK does a deal, then some elements of existing rights and existing approaches will be maintained and others will go. If the UK doesn't do a deal, then things could get quite tricky quite quickly. To just give a couple of illustrations to that, after Brexit and after any period of transition, all of the European citizens resident in the UK will have had to register. And if you haven't registered, you could be deported. Now, doubtless there will be a tit-for-tat response in Europe, and there'll be a position whereby those people who in Europe have not registered may well face deportation. There are also further potential difficulties. So presently, a UK person who works internationally might reside in France, work in Belgium, cross over periodically into Italy or Germany. Once the UK leaves, the EU has threatened that those people will be landlocked into the individual European country in which they presently reside. So they would then lose freedom of movement through Europe. Looking then conversely at what happens in the UK, the big challenge facing companies here is that a lot of the European nationals feel very unnerved by Brexit, and the numbers coming to the UK have diminished. The result of this is that presently certain sectors, certain types of business are facing difficulties maintaining the European national talent pool. That's because there's a normal turnover of a certain number of European nationals per year, and because people are not coming in, what they're seeing is a reduction in the available talent pool. So the self-evident pattern that's emerging is that European Union nationals are becoming a much more difficult resource to recruit and retain, and it's likely in future to be more difficult to work with Europe because it's more difficult to retain them and more difficult to have British people working over in Europe.
So doesn't that mean that you've got, again, maybe a UK hub? It's making it more difficult to move people and goods through the UK into the rest of Europe. Now you've got less people, so that UK hub company is having harder times attracting talent from the rest of Europe. So that's just another factor for them to maybe move to other countries. And which are the most popular cities maybe to be a hub if they don't pick if a company doesn't pick the UK?
Well, obviously a big driver is language. Another big driver is the type of industry and business that tends to operate in the particular city concerned. So if the issue is English, people find Dublin a popular location. That also is true of financial services. Meanwhile, particular types of industries such as insurance, and many of my colleagues here might want to add their views on particular industry sectors. Insurance often likes Brussels because it's close to the European Union headquarters. And banking, these days, Frankfurt is popular because the European Central Bank is headquartered in Frankfurt. Now, a number of these offshoots, or perhaps new European hub entities, may still well have a lot of their staff in London and try to work remotely, but the centre of gravity to some degree shifts to the European Union because there has to be a physical move of certain operations over there in order to maintain the operations that previously came through London, but now then going forward need to take place through cities in Europe. Does anybody here want to add to that?
I think you probably covered it actually, Marek, yeah.
Yeah.
I think obviously, Mark, you've got the situation that in the many of the financial services areas, many companies have already started to press the button. Decision, as we said earlier on, is due in terms of what the negotiating stance is going to be by the end of this year. But in some ways, that's almost too late for many of these organisations that actually want to start their plans, because it takes 12 to 18 months to actually affect them. There is going to need to be clarity on that respect, but many have already started to move.
It's just, the more you get into this and get into the layers, the more incredibly complex this is. So we're actually at our question session, and I've got a really interesting one for our first question from the audience. Will the UK be able to rejoin the EU in the future? So I know you haven't left yet, but what do you think of that?
Okay.
Well, I think there's a theoretical, practical answer, and then there's the political answer to that, Mark. So, in principle, you'd think that, however much they might have personal feelings about it, the rest of Europe would be very willing to entertain the UK rejoining, mainly because of money. So we've heard about the divorce bill, but as you heard from John, we also make a huge contribution to the European budget each year, and one of the issues for them going forwards is how they fill that gap. And there's a number of different ways you can calculate it, but however you do, we are one of the top 3 contributors to the budget. It'll be a huge budget gap to fill. On those grounds alone, you might think they'd welcome us back. But you can see politically, it could be extremely difficult to persuade 27 other member states, because these things are generally by unanimous vote. So all you need is one small country to object, and they could block the UK from rejoining. And then they also would have a vested interest in not making it too easy to reverse a decision like that. They're meant to be once in a generation decisions. So they would certainly not want to encourage the idea that you can nip out of the European Union, try it alone for a few years, and if you change your mind, nip back in again. It's not meant to be an easy thing to do. Yeah.
And just to pick up one additional point on that, Britain is the beneficiary of a huge range of individual specific opt-outs and accommodations from which we've benefited for many years since joining the EU. Were we to try to go back in again, given the amount of aggravation that the European Union regards us as causing, it's a big question as to whether we'd be offered those on re-entry. So we may find ourselves, if rejoining, only able to rejoin on the same standard terms as a small country that might have latterly joined the European Union, rather than a valued partner that's been around a number of years.
No, that's an excellent point. So as an example, the Schengen Agreement I mentioned earlier, the UK opts out of that.
Zero rates for VAT.
The euro is a currency of 19 other member states. We don't have the euro. Exactly as Mate said, would we really be allowed in on terms that actually would be acceptable to us?
Right. So we've got another question, and is it likely that there will be an added structure to the currently existing structure, i.e. Norway, Switzerland, and Turkey, to accommodate the modified request of the UK, or do you think the UK will be forced to fit it into an existing structure? So I guess if you go a soft Brexit, is there going to be additional structures necessary to help this exit?
Yeah, it's Nick. Just a general point on that, Mark. That is essentially the UK government's position, is they want a bespoke deal. They don't want a Norway, they want a lot of the good things and not so many of the things they don't like. So if they're successful, and who knows, they might be successful, then on John's little chart, you might have the UK option, which, so yeah, that's essentially the government's position, to have a bespoke deal.
Okay. Here's a really, I think, a hard one, but maybe get your feelings on it. Do you think there's going to be a net winner or net loser in Brexit? Meaning, EU versus UK, or maybe it's even, maybe Frankfurt ends up being the net winner because they now become the new hub. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the general observation seems to be that initially, both the EU as it then remains without the UK and the UK both lose. Because initially, everybody suffers additional friction, aggravation, interruption to trade, interruption to GDP growth. Now, then the big debate subsequently is, will Britain withdrawing then have a stimulus effect on the EU and make them draw closer together, thereby stimulating the European Union to grow and develop in a different direction? And will Britain, because it's then competing with the EU, have to raise its game and thereby itself improve? Now, in an ideal situation, going forward, both parties would do better than they might have done in this union together. But who knows? One may come out ahead of the other. An interesting facet of what's happened subsequent to Brexit is that France is pushing forward for greater European Union integration and is having some success on that. And Germany, whilst it shows some reticence to it, is being pulled along by France's new enthusiasm. So we may well see the remaining Europe move more in the direction of the United States of Europe, which is something Britain's always been against. But now that Britain isn't going to be within the EU, it can't easily oppose. So the next 15 years will let us know.
Yeah, well, that's a great summary. And that brings us to the end of the seminar. I'd like to thank the panelists for their fantastic work in this and really look forward to more discussions as Brexit unfolds. And for the audience, please look for invites and for our subsequent Brexit webinars. We're going to be following along Brexit as it goes and have periodic webinars like these. So thanks very much. Thanks very much for the panelists.
And thank you, Mark, and thank you for everyone for attending today's webinar, Navigating the Uncertainty of Brexit to Plot a Course for Success. If you have any other questions, please contact our presenters directly. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive the slide deck and the link to the recording. On behalf of Citron Cooperman and Moore Stevens, thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.